Hello, my name is Alex Thornton and I'm from the University of Exeter in the UK. And today I'm going to be talking to you about social learning processes. In this lecture we're going to begin by considering the diversity of different social learning processes that exist in the animal kingdom. And the key take-home message here is that just like there isn't just one way in which we as humans can learn from one another, there's also a diversity of different means through which other animals can learn from one another. And we're going to be thinking about some of those processes today. We'll begin by thinking about inadvertent social learning. So this is really the vast majority of social learning that happens in the animal kingdom, where animals are learning from others who are just going about their daily business. We'll think about how social learning might occur through indirect processes, such as enhancement, as well as through more direct processes, such as observational conditioning or imitation. We're then going to move on to thinking about teaching. This is a special form of social learning, something that we as humans do regularly, but there's also evidence for teaching in other animals. And critically, unlike all other forms of social learning, teaching involves knowledgeable individuals playing an active role to help others to learn. And finally, we'll be thinking a little bit about the consequences of social learning processes. Why does this really matter? We'll think about how social learning can allow individual behaviour to develop, how individuals can acquire critical skills or knowledge by learning from others. And we'll also think about the development of group behaviour. If individuals can learn from one another, then there's the potential for information to spread through groups and to actually change the behaviour of the group as a whole, to generate traditions or cultures. So we'll begin by thinking about what social learning is. And here I'm going to recap a definition that Andy Whiten gave you in the previous lecture. It's very important to understand what we mean by social learning before we go much further. A classic definition of social learning is this one here, given by Celia Hayes in 1994. Hayes defined social learning as learning that is influenced by observational or interactions with another individual or its products. Now this final phrase, or its products, will be a little bit clearer when we give some of the examples later on in the lecture. But something else to note is that while we as humans might be very used to thinking of social learning through observation, visual observation, actually there's no particular reason why it needs to be through observation alone. So in the animal kingdom, as in humans, we'll see that social learning can happen through auditory channels. You might, for example, listen to somebody singing a catchy tune and copy that catchy tune. And that kind of copying of songs is something that we also see in birds and whales, for example. And you can also have social learning through olfactory channels. And remember that for most mammals, actually the olfactory channel is probably the dominant channel. So a lot of social learning might happen through smell. Another really important point to note is the diversity of different animals that we see on this slide here. Now you might have come into this lecture course thinking, well, social learning is something we as humans do all the time, we learn from each other, and perhaps it's something that other animals that are closely related to us, like the apes and the monkeys, maybe they do it, maybe large-brained animals do it. But actually we now know that social learning is pretty much ubiquitous across the animal kingdom. Animals as diverse as bees and fruit flies that we see here on the slide, all the way to fish, birds, mammals. All of these animals have been shown to be capable of social learning. Interestingly, there's even evidence that some animals that are not particularly social can also learn from others. So here we see a picture of a red-footed tortoise. This is a very solitary animal, lives most of its life alone. But in a series of neat experiments by Anna Wilkinson and her colleagues, they showed that these rather solitary animals can nevertheless learn from others under the right circumstances. So social learning is very common, happens throughout the animal kingdom, and it can happen through a variety of different processes. And that's what we're going to turn our attention to now. How do animals learn socially? What are the mechanisms, the processes through which animals can acquire information from others? Well, the vast majority of social learning, as I told you in the introduction, occurs through inadvertent social learning. So what do we mean by that? It basically means that the knowledgeable individual is just going about its usual business, and the onus for learning is on other naive individuals. So in the photograph here, for example, you see an adult capuchin monkey in Central America that's using hammer and anvil to crack a nut. And it's busy doing that, and while it's doing it, there's a juvenile individual observing it. Now, the juvenile might learn something through this observation, but critically, the adult isn't doing anything different when it's being observed by a juvenile compared to when it's alone. So the adult's just going about its business, and inadvertently, others might learn from it. And this is critically different to teaching. Teaching is an active form of social learning in which knowledgeable individuals, those who know information or skills, actively help naive individuals to learn. And the evidence for teaching in the animal kingdom is relatively sparse, but there are some examples. Later on in this lecture, I'll introduce you to an example from my own research on wild meerkats in the Kalahari, which are one of the few animals that are known to actively teach. But before we get onto that, let's begin with inadvertent social learning. So as I said, this is social learning whereby one individual is just going about its business and other individuals can learn from that individual. Now, there's lots of different ways of classifying the different social learning processes, and if you go through the literature, you'll find a number of different reviews that have slightly different classifications. Here I'm going to use Will Hoppett and Kevin Leyland's classification. This is a classification that I find particularly useful. Now, Hoppett and Leyland, in a paper in 2008, identified 10 different processes. Now, I'm not going to go through them all today. For those of you who are particularly interested, I do recommend that you go and read the paper that's cited here. But one of the points that Hoppett and Leyland make is that we might divide social learning processes into those that happen indirectly and those that happen directly. And within each of these groups, there's a diversity of different subcategories. So what do we mean by that? Well, let's imagine, for instance, that I've picked up a banana, you're watching me, and you might watch me open up the banana and take a bite. As a result of watching that, you might then replicate that behaviour. You might copy it or copy something like it. That would be a form of direct social learning because you're learning directly through having seen what I was doing. And that could also happen through listening, for example. You might hear me sing a little song and copy it yourself. So these are direct forms of social learning, and processes that can lead directly to social learning include things like observational conditioning, emulation, and imitation. And we'll see some examples of some of those processes later on. But what about indirect processes? Well, let's imagine again that I've been fiddling around with this banana and I just left it lying around on the table. Now, later on, you might come into this room and see that this banana's been left open. Perhaps you didn't even see me opening it. But because it's been left open, it smells nice, your attention is attracted to it, you might start to manipulate it and realise through your own actions that this is something worth eating. You might even realise that because I've begun to open it, if you carry on pulling down the skin, you can completely open up the fruit inside. So this would be an indirect process. It would be a process of stimulus enhancement, and we'll see in more detail what that means in the next slide. But critically, I have shaped your learning in some way because through my actions, indirectly, I've attracted your attention to this particular stimulus, but then you, as a result of that, have learnt through your own actions. So these indirect forms of social learning occur when individuals learn through their own actions, but their attention has been in some way modified by other individuals. So social processes have mediated what is learnt. So let's have an example of such indirect social learning. Probably the most common forms of social learning are things like local enhancement and stimulus enhancement. What do we mean by those? What we mean is that the presence or the actions of another individual attract attention to a particular location or a particular stimulus and promote learning. So the little example I just gave you with the banana could be an example of stimulus enhancement. If I've attracted your attention to the banana and you've then gone on to learn on your own. A classic example of this kind of learning occurs in a nice study of rats by Leyland and Plotkin in the early 1990s. So in this study what they did was they had a group of what they called demonstrator rats. And these rats were trained to prefer food that was flavoured either with cocoa or with cinnamon. And they would put these rats into an arena that contained both types of food, so the demonstrator rat would go off and feed on its preferred type of food. They then removed the demonstrator and put a new naive rat, a rat that had never been trained to prefer either kind of food. Interestingly, what they found is that these naive rats then preferred the food that the demonstrator ate. And interestingly, when they were retested 24 hours later, they still carried on preferring the food that the demonstrator ate. So here you seem to have the transmission of a food preference from a demonstrator to a new, naive individual, even though these two animals have never actually interacted with each other. So what could be going on here? Well, this graph here illustrates what happened. So in the graph we can see that the white bars are cinnamon flavoured diet and the black bars are cocoa flavoured diet, and on the y-axis, the vertical axis, we have how much of each type of food the rats consumed. So on the far side we have control rats. These are rats that were just put into the arena and they had not been exposed to demonstrators before, so this is just looking at what preferences naive rats had. And overall the white bars here are larger, so rats tended to prefer the cinnamon over the chocolate if given a free choice. But then in the next block of bars along, we see that if rats had had a cinnamon demonstrator, in other words, there had been a rat that had been trained to eat cinnamon in the arena, that rat had wandered around, eaten the cinnamon flavoured food, been removed, you then put naive rats in, those naive rats develop a strong preference for the cinnamon, even stronger than they would under control conditions. Whereas if, on the far side of the graph, the demonstrator had been trained to eat cocoa flavoured food, then these new naive rats also developed a preference for the cocoa. So, as I say here, the naive rats and the demonstrators have not interacted with each other in any way. So how is it that the naive rats have come to acquire the same preference as the demonstrator? Well, Leyland and Plotkin suggest that what's going on here is that while the demonstrator rats are wandering around in the arena, they move towards their preferred food source, they forage on that food source, and while they're doing that, they leave excretory deposits. They leave fecal cues and urine. These rats are then removed by the experimenter, and a new rat comes in. These new rats prefer to forage in areas where other rats have previously been foraging. So they smell these fecal cues and they prefer to go to that area, presumably because it serves as a cue that that area is safe if other rats have previously been there. These naive rats then forage in that area, encounter the food, taste it, and develop a preference for that food, and that preference is then maintained for reasonably long periods of time. So this is a classic example of local enhancement, where the products of a demonstrator, and here remember back to Celia Hayes' definition in an earlier slide, where we talk about observation or interaction with other individuals or their products. Well, here the products of the demonstrator, namely fecal and urine cues, attract the attention of new individuals to that location and promote learning. And so you can get the spread of new food preference through groups through this rather simple process. So that is a nice example of a form of indirect learning. What about direct social learning? Well, one nice example of direct social learning is what's known as observational conditioning. And Probably the nicest example of this is in work by a German scientist called Ernst Curieux, working in the late 1970s and the early 1980s. So Curieux designed a very neat experiment, which is shown in the figure here. So in this experiment, you have two blackbirds, and we'll label them the demonstrator and the observer. Now, the demonstrator can see in front of it a stuffed owl. And if you are a blackbird, an owl is a very scary thing, it's a potential predator. So this demonstrator is freaking out. It's mobbing, it's uttering alarm calls, it's showing classical signs of fear of this predator. On the other side, there's an observer. Now, the observer cannot see the owl, but it can see the demonstrator freaking out. And as a result of seeing that, it too starts to exhibit signs of fear. But what the observer can see at the same time is, in this case, an innocuous bird that doesn't pose it any threat at all. So a bird of a totally non-threatening species. So now the observer starts to mob. It associates that mobbing response with this innocuous bird and develops a fearful response to this bird. Interestingly, Curieux also did experiments where he replaced the innocuous bird with a bottle, and again the observer developed a fear towards the bottle. So this kind of social learning allows fearful responses, in this case, to be transmitted directly from one individual to another. And in the wild, this kind of thing might be extremely useful. Imagine that you are an animal wandering around in an area, and into that area has recently arrived a new kind of predator. And this is something that happens very commonly on islands, and generally animals living on islands have no evolved fearful response towards new predators, and as a result they consequently often get eaten and populations decline drastically. So if there's a new predator, there's two ways to learn about it. One is to learn through your own interactions with the predator. The problem there, of course, is that if I interact with the predator, there's a very high chance that I'm going to end up dead. So that's a very costly way of learning. On the other hand, if I see you interacting with the predator, then I might learn from that, perhaps through a process of observational conditioning, and I can learn to be scared of this new predator and to avoid this new predator without having to experience it myself. So this kind of behaviour can be really useful in allowing novel anti-predator behaviours to spread. So how does it work? What's going on in this kind of learning? Well, effectively what this is a kind of Pavlovian conditioning. Some of you might have come across Pavlovian conditioning before. This is also known as classical conditioning. So the famous example, of course, is the Russian scientist Pavlov, who, when he presented his dog with food, would ring a bell at the same time. And over time, the dog came to associate the sound with food and would begin to salivate even when it just heard the bell and there was no food present. So you've associated a previously neutral stimulus with a stimulus that causes a response. And this is exactly the same kind of thing, except that in this case, one of the stimuli is a social stimulus. So we can think about this if we think about two time phases. Let's call them T1 and T2. So in T1, our observer is initially naive, and it hears and sees what we'll call the US, the unconditioned stimulus. So these are the mobbing calls and the behaviour of the demonstrator. This is something that elicits an automatic response, if you like, in the observer. At the same time as experiencing the US, the animal is also experiencing the CS, which is the conditioned stimulus. So that could be a bottle or this innocuous bird. In the case of Curieux's experiments, it was a honey eater. So you're experiencing the US and the CS simultaneously, and the US, the unconditioned stimulus, elicits an unconditioned response. So when I see another individual starting to exhibit fearful mobbing responses, I start to do that too. As a result of these associations, in time 2, the conditioned stimulus, the bottle or the honey eater, now elicits the same response. We now call this the conditioned response. So now whenever the observer bird sees the bottle or the honey eater, it starts to exhibit this mobbing response. So this is a relatively common form of social learning. that happens fairly widely throughout the animal kingdom. And I want to talk a little bit about another form of direct social learning, imitation. Now, imitation is often held up as the gold standard for social learning. And what imitation involves is copying the form of an action. So in other words, copying not only the outcome, but the precise way that the action was conducted. Now, let's imagine that I am now going to make a bit of a fool of myself by doing a little demonstration, and you are going to imitate me. So, I'm going to do this. Now, I'm standing here, exposing myself to the view of the viewing public. You're sitting at home comfortably, I hope, and so you can try and replicate my actions. So you might have seen that I slowly closed my fist, brought my fist towards my cheek, and repeated that 3 times. Now, if you copied my bodily actions, then we might call that imitation. And interestingly, you might think that there's different scales, different levels of fidelity when you copy me. So when you're looking at me, I'm tapping my right cheek. Now, very often, because I'm the mirror image of you, that will lead observers to actually tap their left cheek in the mirror image. So if you also tapped your right cheek, so you've mapped on my actions directly onto your own face, then you might think that that's a more faithful form of imitation than if you simply mirrored what I've done. And this idea of mirroring is often thought of as fairly critical to imitation. So psychologists have often argued that imitation is particularly cognitively demanding because it involves what we call the correspondence problem. In other words, needing to map one's own actions onto the actions that one observes in a demonstrator. And in some cases that might require you to reason about the way that bodies are mirrored onto each other if you're observing somebody directly. And this kind of social learning via imitation is often assumed to be particularly important for human culture. And the reason for that is that as humans we do all sorts of things that are causally opaque, so that means it's very difficult from just looking at them to work out how they work. So think of sorts of tools and technologies that we use every day, the camera that's filming this TV screen, the phones that most of you will have in your pockets. It's very difficult to work out by just looking at those things how on earth they work or how they're constructed. So if you wanted to learn how to fix one of those devices and you were learning from an expert, you might well want to copy the precise processes through which they did each action, because perhaps the way that you do things is important. And so there is an argument that because of our heavy reliance on tools and technologies as a species, that this form of imitation could be particularly useful. And for a long time there's been extensive debate as to whether imitation is just something that we as humans do and is exclusive to us, or whether actually imitation might be more widely shared with other animals. And this is extremely controversial. I'm going to show you just 2 examples here, but now there are a number of potential cases of imitation in a variety of different bird and mammal species. But something to bear in mind is that all of these cases are controversial, so you may well come across in the literature critiques of these studies or alternative interpretations of the results. One example I'd like to give you is the case of marmosets. These are little monkeys that live in South America. So in this particular study, it's a lab study done by Völkel and Huber, they had these marmosets opening a little jar, as you can see in these pictures, either using their mouth or using their hand. Now critically, in both cases, they're opening the same part of the jar, they're opening the same lid, they're directing their attention to exactly the same portion of the stimulus. So it's very difficult, if copying is occurring, to explain this in terms of stimulus or local enhancement. Because actually what these scientists found is that after observing demonstrators showing one or other of these techniques, observers would then copy the same technique. So this seems to be a case of what we might call contextual imitation. Opening things up, fruits perhaps, with either your mouth or your hand, that's something that's part of the ordinary behavioural repertoire of marmosets. And what seems to be going on here is that by observing others, they're learning to deploy that part of their repertoire in a particular context. So hence we call this contextual imitation. Some people have argued that this is rather different to many of the forms of imitation that we see in humans, where we learn to perform entirely new sequences that aren't already part of our behavioural repertoire. So this is what we might call production imitation. And the evidence for production imitation in animals is even more controversial than other forms of imitation. And nevertheless, there are some nice examples that provide pretty solid evidence that some animals show this kind of imitation, at least to a degree. But as I say again, you will find dissenting voices in the literature, so it's up to you to read this work and make your own minds up. One classic example is in a series of studies by Andy Whiten during the 1990s, where he devised what he called an artificial fruit. So this is a container that has inside it a bit of food, so in a way it replicates cases in the wild where an animal might find kind of food that's encased in a hard husk and needs to open that up in order to acquire the tasty, nutritious food inside it. So in this case, chimpanzees and human children both observed a human demonstrator opening this artificial fruit using the little bolts that you can see in the picture and either twisting or poking those bolts. So again, the attention is directed to the same part of the apparatus, but there's a different body action involved. And both species seem to show a degree of imitation. The children showed far higher fidelity. They copied what the demonstrator did very faithfully. The chimpanzees less so, but nevertheless they still copied more than expected by chance. So this suggests that chimpanzees perhaps are capable of production imitation, at least to a degree. So far we've been thinking about cases of inadvertent social learning. So just to recap, these are cases where one individual is just going about its business and others can learn from that individual. Now we're going to think about something rather different. We're going to think about teaching. Critically, teaching is a form of cooperation in that it involves one individual making an investment into helping others to learn. How might we go about looking for evidence of teaching in the wild? The critical point is that knowledgeable individuals change their behaviour in a way that promotes learning by the naive. And this contrasts with all the forms of inadvertent social learning that we've seen so far. So in all the forms that we've seen previously, the knowledgeable individual doesn't have to do anything differently when it's in the presence of a naive individual, it just goes about its business. In order to study teaching, Tim Caro and Mark Hauser came up with an operational definition that allows us to go out and collect data on animals and determine whether what they're doing really counts as a form of teaching. So their definition involves three criteria. The first is that the knowledgeable individual modifies its behaviour in the presence of a naive one. In other words, it's changing what it's doing. Secondly, this knowledgeable individual incurs some cost, or at least it derives no immediate benefit. So it's not changing its behaviour in a way that's immediately beneficial to itself, but it's changing its behaviour in a way that down the line will help to promote learning in another individual. And so this leads us to the final criterion, which is that the naive individual should learn something as a result of the knowledgeable individual's behaviour. And in helping this naive individual to learn, the teacher will ultimately derive some benefit as well. So in the animal kingdom, cases of teaching, for example, are often between parents and offspring, where parents will benefit from teaching their offspring something. In the case of meerkats, it's not only parents, but other members of the social group who teach. But these are animals in which individuals are often related, so they gain benefits from helping relatives and from raising the size of their groups by raising the next generation. So I studied these animals, meerkats, in the Kalahari Desert for the best part of my early career. And these are highly social mongoose species that have a really rather difficult foraging niche, as you can see in these photographs. So the pups on the top row, we've got one pup who's eating a snake, another one who's eating a solifuge. This is a highly aggressive arachnid. On the bottom row we can see one little pup eating a gecko. Now it's not a dangerous food item, but if you've ever tried to catch a gecko, it's extremely difficult to do. These are very fast moving, hard to catch animals. And the other little pup is eating a paraboothed scorpion, which has neurotoxins powerful enough to kill a human being. So all of these photographs illustrate the point that these pups need to learn how to catch very difficult and potentially dangerous prey. But the problem is that young pups virtually never find these sorts of prey items on their own. The only chance they get to interact with these sorts of prey items are when adults feed them. And so by feeding them in particular ways, the adults can help the pups to acquire important skills. What we see is that the adults gradually introduce their pups to live prey. When the pups are very young, the adults will typically go and find prey items, kill them, and bring them to the pups. As the pups start to get older, the adults will increasingly give away prey that's still alive. And that's what's illustrated here in this graph. So along the x-axis we can see the age of the pups from 30 days when they first emerge from their underground burrows until they're about 90 days old, by which time they are independent and capable of hunting for themselves. So as they get older, adults are increasingly likely to give away prey that is still intact. And these two lines show the white squares are scorpions and the black ones are other kinds of mobile prey. So in both cases, as the pups get older, adults increasingly give away prey that's still alive. Often the adults will modify the prey in some way. So if it's a scorpion, for example, the adult might bite the sting off the scorpion and then present it to the pup. So now the pup has the opportunity to interact, to practice its handling skills with this difficult prey item, but without the danger of being stung. And that's what we can see in this video. So here you can see an adult meerkat biting the sting of a scorpion. It then allows a pup to come in and handle the scorpion. Now you'll see that the adult stays behind to monitor what the pup is doing. Often pups really struggle when given live prey like this and the prey escapes, so the adult might go and catch it and bring it back again. If the pup is really struggling, the adult might modify it further. So rather than just dropping the prey item and running, the adult has to stay behind and monitor what the pup is doing in order to give the pup this chance. And now our pup has grabbed his scorpion and run off. So as you can see in the video, giving away live prey like this is costly. It would be far easier for an adult meerkat to just kill a scorpion and present that to a pup. It takes an adult meerkat a fraction of a second to kill a scorpion. But by giving away live prey, you've got the risk that the prey might escape, so you lose your investment. There's the risk of injury to the pups, and there's more time spent monitoring the pups, as you can see in the graph here. So as pups get older, for any given age of pup, if you give away live prey as an adult, you need to spend more time monitoring the pup than if you give away dead prey. So this is clearly costly behaviour from the point of view of the adults. So why do they do it? Well, the answer is that by doing this, by providing pups with these opportunities, they are helping the pups to learn. And this is something that's actually very difficult to demonstrate, because it could be that if the pups are getting better at hunting as they get older, this is simply because they're becoming larger, their dexterity is improving. It could have nothing to do with what the adults are doing. So in order to try and test whether there's a causal link between the adult's behaviour and the acquisition of skills by the pups, my colleague Catherine McAuliffe and I designed a simple experiment where we replicated what the adults were doing. So we had a number of different pups across different litters and different groups of meerkats, and to some of them we gave a fixed number of live scorpions every day for a number of days. Some of their siblings were given the same number of dead scorpions every day, and a third group of siblings were given an equivalent mass of hard-boiled egg. Now on the final day we presented all of these pups with a live scorpion, and what we found is that those who had had additional opportunities to practice handling live scorpions were far better. So in this graph you can see that 100% of them were then successful in handling a scorpion and eating it. They were also faster and they handled it more efficiently. So the adults are providing pups with an opportunity to learn that they wouldn't otherwise have, and as a result of this, the pups are acquiring critical skills. So this is a form of teaching. We now know that there are a number of animal teachers. There's strong experimental evidence for teaching not only in meerkats but also in a species of ant, the tandem running ant, that teaches other individuals routes to food sources and to the nest, and in various bird species including pied babblers, superb fairy wrens and zebrafinches. The zebrafinch case is a nice example because it mirrors something that we see in humans. So if you've ever watched parents of young babies interacting with their babies, you'll probably have noticed that parents tend to engage in a particular form of speech that we call infant-directed speech or motherese. This involves slowing down the voice, exaggerating vowel sounds, exaggerated intonation. And this seems to help young babies, young infants, to acquire language skills. And the zebrafinches are doing something very similar. So in many birds, young individuals learn to sing by listening to their fathers. So there's a form of social learning here. And the zebrafinches do something very interesting, because when the adults are singing in the presence of young naive offspring, they do something very similar to what adult humans do. They slow down their song, they simplify it, and they exaggerate certain elements of it. And this again seems to help the young to learn how to sing in much the same way as happens in language acquisition in human infants. In addition to these studies where there's strong experimental evidence, there's also suggestive evidence across a number of different bird and mammal species. Probably the strongest evidence occurs in cheetahs and other members of the cat family that do something very similar to what we've seen in meerkats, where adults give away live prey for their young to practice handling. In the picture here on the right, for instance, you can see a mother cheetah who's just brought her cubs a baby impala to practice with. And I want to end the lecture by thinking briefly about the consequences of social learning processes. We've seen that there are lots of means through which animals might learn from one another. Most of those processes are inadvertent, but in some cases there's also teaching going on. But why does this really matter? Well, first of all, it matters because it allows individuals to acquire important behaviour or skills. But it can not only change the behaviour of individuals, social learning can also change the behaviour of entire groups because it can generate traditions or culture. And by modifying the behaviour of both individuals and groups, social learning processes have important ecological implications and also evolutionary implications. And these are issues that we'll be returning to in some of the later lectures in this series. The papers I've flagged up here all address the ecological and evolutionary implications of social learning. They're all papers by people who lecture you in this series of lectures. So I do suggest that you go and track those papers down and have a read of those. So thinking about individual behaviour, why is social learning useful? Well, critically, social learning allows you to bypass the costs of having to learn through your own interactions, or at least bypass some of those costs. And it can help shape the development of important aspects of behaviour, like foraging, as we've seen in meerkats. In some animals, like this Goffin's cockatoo, there's evidence of social learning of tool use. In some species, there's evidence that migratory routes can be socially transmitted. This is something that has very important consequences for conservation strategies. The migratory routes of animals are spread from individual to individual, from generation to generation. Then anything that disrupts the learning process could have catastrophic impacts on populations. There's also evidence of social learning of communication. Of course, classic examples are learning of birdsong. There's also evidence of vocal learning in other mammals like cetaceans and bats. In some species, there's evidence that mate choice is socially learned. So by observing who others choose as a mate, that might influence your own decisions. This is something that you may well see the next time you go to a nightclub. But it doesn't just happen in humans. We see evidence for social learning of mate choice in fish, in birds. We also even see it in fruit flies, as shown in the photograph along the bottom. As we saw earlier in Curio's experiments of observational conditioning, social learning can allow you to learn about predators. It can also allow you to acquire aspects of social behaviour. One example of that is in capuchin monkeys, that engage in some bizarre social rituals. For example, there's some cases where individuals will put their finger into another individual's eye socket. And these bizarre rituals seem to have spread through social networks via social learning. In some species, there's even evidence of social learning of self-medication. So some animals might go and find plants in their natural environment and use those plants to prevent or cure parasitic infections. And again, that behaviour seems in some cases to spread through social learning. So if information can spread through social learning, then there's the potential for it to change the behaviour not only of individuals, but of entire groups. So here we start to think about how traditions and culture can arise. To recap, this is a definition that Andy Whiten gave you in the previous lecture. It comes from this book, The Biology of Traditions, by Fregazi and Perry. They define a tradition as a distinctive behaviour pattern shared by two or more individuals in a social unit, which persists over time, and that new practitioners acquire in part through socially aided learning. So if that's a tradition, what then is culture? Well, many people would treat culture as equivalent to traditions. So a lot of people in the literature that you'll see use these two terms interchangeably to describe cases in which information spreads through groups to become characteristic of that group. Other people might argue that you should define culture as involving multiple different traditions. This is a view espoused by Andy Whiten, for example. But regardless of how we define culture, the critical point is that it requires information to spread through social learning. The key ingredients for this are innovation and transmission. Innovation is necessary because if a new behaviour is going to spread, that new behaviour needs to arise. So we can define innovation as cases when an individual comes up with any kind of new behaviour. And in this lecture I'm not going to go into innovation, but for those of you who are interested, there's a very good book by Reeder and Leyland on animal innovation, and a recent special issue of the journal Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society that deals with the circumstances under which animals might innovate, the sorts of cognitive processes that might be involved. But if new behaviours arise through innovation, then, if they're transmitted, there's the potential for them to generate traditions or culture. And we used to think that only complex, sophisticated forms of social learning, like imitation, would allow information to spread with sufficiently high fidelity to generate traditions. And for a long time people thought that as a result perhaps humans were the only species that shows culture. But of course, as we see in this lecture series, that's not the case. We now have evidence that even relatively simple social learning processes can generate traditions. So to illustrate that, I want to take you back to an example that Andy Whiten gave you in the first lecture. Andy told you about the cases of British birds, blue tits and great tits, that learnt to peck open milk bottles during the first half of the 20th century in the UK. So in these cases, these birds are learning to peck open these tinfoil lids of milk bottles that used to be delivered to the doorsteps of British houses. And this behaviour seemed to spread through different populations. It seemed to generate local traditions in different parts of the country. The key question here is, how is this information spreading? In order to address this, Sherry and Galef in the 1980s designed a clever experiment in black-capped chickadees, which are close relatives of the blue tits and grey tits that were opening milk bottles in the UK. So in this experiment, they trained demonstrator individuals to open tubs of cream. Once these demonstrators were then trained, they set up a series of different experimental conditions. In one condition, observers were allowed to watch demonstrators opening the tub of cream. And when these observers were then tested on their own, they were then able to open the tub themselves. So observing others seems to promote social learning. In another case, observers simply watched an empty cage that contained a closed tub. And in this case, no social learning occurred. But in a third case, observers were allowed to feed from a tub that had already been opened. And in this case, the observers did then learn how to open the tubs themselves. So this provides us with a potential mechanism through which milk bottle opening in these birds in the UK might have spread. Imagine a case where an individual bird is coming across a bottle that's already been opened. It'll land on the bottle, perch on it, peck to drink the cream. The next time it encounters a closed milk bottle, it may well land on it, peck downwards using the same action, and so learn that the tinfoil lid can be opened. So here this is a simple process of local or stimulus enhancement, whereby the fact that another individual has interacted with and opened a bottle will draw other individuals' attention to that and promote learning. So this is rather similar to the example of black rats that I gave you earlier on in the lecture. And so this relatively simple form of social learning could in fact lead to the spread of behaviour through groups. To illustrate this is an example from an experiment run by Lucy Applin, who will be lecturing you later on. So Lucy designed this very neat experiment that involved grey tits having to open this little device here. And they would open the device by pecking the door, either on the right-hand side or the left-hand side, the blue side or the red side, and that would release a mealworm. You can see that in action in this little video. So you can see you've got individuals coming to open this door. Now critically, what Lucy did was that she initially caught some individuals and she trained them in the lab to open the door using either the right side or the left side, the blue side or the red side. She then released these individuals back into the wild where they could be observed by others. And what you found is that the behaviour very rapidly spread through groups. So in this social network, the yellow dots show the trained demonstrators, and you can see that the behaviour spreads to other individuals. So as the dots turn red, these are new individuals acquiring the behaviour. So it spreads through social networks. Individuals that tend to hang out together are more likely to learn this new behaviour. And interestingly, not only did they learn how to get the food, but they also tended to use the same technique that the demonstrator did. So in populations where the demonstrator pushed the blue side of the door, other individuals also learned to push the blue side of the door, and that behaviour spread until about 80% of the local populations were performing this behaviour. So this is likely to involve some similar processes to what we saw in the previous case, where your attention is drawn to a particular side of the door by the actions of other individuals. You then go and peck, and as a result you learn how to open the door yourself. So these simple processes may lead to the spread of local traditions. There's now been a series of experiments showing that traditions can spread through social learning. Most of these have been in the lab, in animals as diverse as fruit flies, fish, birds, rats, and primates. But increasingly there's a number of experiments conducted in the lab, like Lucy's experiments on great tits. I've done experiments on meerkats. There's various experiments on different primate species showing that information can spread through social learning. In the vast majority of the cases, we actually don't know precisely what processes are involved in allowing this information to spread. But the critical point is that it can lead to behavioural traditions where members of a group are all doing similar things. So we've seen that social learning can be extremely useful. It can allow individuals to acquire important skills. It can change the behaviour of groups and generate traditions. But an important point to note is that social learning is not always a good idea. If I went around copying everything I saw, I would acquire all sorts of information that's outdated, useless, potentially even dangerous. So if you're going to learn socially, you need to be selective in who you learn from and under what circumstances you might learn from others, rather than relying on your own interactions with the environment. And these social learning strategies are something that will be covered in the next lecture. Thank you very much.